Stop the world!
The Europeans, I see them shaken to a degree I never saw when Trump won. Even in 2018, when there was a moment at which it looked as though Trump might pull out of NATO at the summit that year. And this is different. And it's different not just in words and rhetoric, but now it's different in money.
Welcome to Stop the World, the ASPI podcast. I'm David Rowe.
And I'm Olivia Nelson.
Well, Liv, it's now officially an occupational hazard that a podcast is going to be out of date by the time you release it. We've often said that there's a lot going on in the world, but it turns out we didn't appreciate just how fast the news can break. Over the weekend, Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky met with President Trump in the White House, and we all saw how that ended. But so much has happened even since then.
That's right, Dave. We've seen President Trump's address to Congress. President Zelensky met with UK Prime Minister Keir Starmer and European leaders to discuss a peace plan and ongoing support for Ukraine. President Trump announced the US is pulling support from Ukraine, and French President Macron promised a big defence investment and offered a nuclear umbrella for European neighbours. The EU also announced an €800 billion rearm Europe plan, and Zelensky effectively apologised to Trump to try and get beyond the Oval Office meeting. That was a lot to get through, Dave.
Indeed, and the developments keep coming. So to discuss all the latest, we have a very special guest on the pod today, Shashank Joshi, renowned security expert and defence editor with The Economist. Shashank has the rare combination of a journalist's proximity to first-hand sources and an analyst's depth in interpreting what it all means, and that's a rare combination.
I couldn't agree more. Shashank is a superb commentator and expert on defence, as well as his 6+ years with The Economist. He was previously a senior research fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London and research associate at Oxford's Changing Character of War programme.
And just to note, we recorded this Wednesday night Canberra time. Things have moved a little since then. Shashank actually warned us a couple of times that observations he was making might be superseded by events by the time we release the conversation. He was right, but don't worry, the observations remain valid and insightful.
It's a fascinating conversation that dives into the Trump administration's foreign policy, including its relationship with Russia, transatlantic relations, and prospects for peace and security in Ukraine. That's enough from us. Over to you, Dave and Shashank.
I'm here with Shashank Joshi. Shashank, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me back on.
I want to start with a broad observation on the past 6 weeks in terms of US behaviour and transatlantic relations. Obviously, a huge amount has happened. It feels that a lot has crystallised about Trump's foreign and security philosophy as it bears on Ukraine, Russia and Europe. How would you summarise the main shifts we've seen in the past few weeks?
Well, just to take us back a little bit, I and my colleagues, and indeed many officials in Europe, were frantically poring over the writings of Trump administration officials and appointees, people like General Keith Kellogg, the Ukraine envoy, as if these contained some esoteric clues to what the administration would do, because that's all you have to go on in these administrations. You know, it's the president's whim and it's the views of his advisors. And we looked over these Kellogg writings and others, and they looked okay. They looked okay. They wanted a deal in Ukraine. They understood that they would need to put considerable pressure on Russia to get that deal. They understood that they would need to potentially threaten additional sanctions. They would need to keep Ukraine supplied with arms to give it leverage. And they would need a lasting deal, one which would have robust guarantees, even if those guarantees would need to come from Europeans. I think what's happened in the last few weeks, starting with Trump's direct unilateral opening of talks to Russia without involving the Ukrainians and the Europeans, the J.D. Vance speech at Munich attacking European allies and their democracies, the remarkable contretemps in the Oval Office and the humiliation of Zelensky, the cutting of aid, all of these things, I think, have persuaded European allies that this administration is much more radical than they anticipated, that it's not clear whether it really seeks a balanced and lasting deal, rather than any kind of imposition on Ukraine that would allow Trump to claim he stopped the conflict. And I think this is profoundly concerning for Europeans. There appears to be no willingness whatsoever to impose any pressure or even criticize the Russian side. And all the pressure is on the Ukrainian side. And at this point in time, it looks as though America is considerably more closely aligned to and sympathetic with Russia than with Ukraine. And to Europeans who thought they might be able to bargain with the administration, put troops on the table, show that they had skin in the game. This looks like a calamitous shift in American mindset and policy, and we are all reeling from the shock.
So, what does it? I mean, you've pointed to the worrying nature of that for Europe. Before we get on to Ukraine, some of the specifics about Ukraine, I mean, what should Europe be worried about over the longer term if Trump is indeed going to pursue a very, very generous arrangement with Russia that doesn't impose any costs on Putin, in fact, rewards him for his aggression? I mean, what do you see as the principal concerns that Europe is going to have down the track? What might Putin do as a consequence?
Well, I think there's three buckets of concerns we could discuss. One of them is Ukraine itself and the prospect that a deal holds for a short period, but because of the absence of robust security guarantees, it turns out to be another Minsk, and that Russia rearms while Ukraine struggles to rearm with Western support ebbing, and that Russia reinvades or otherwise exploits a weakened Ukraine to finish what it could not achieve in 2022. And that's concern number one. Concern number two, I think, is the spillover for the broader European security order, because if you have an American government that is willing to call in the leader of an ally at war and humiliate them in the Oval Office and demand that they hand over a fictional $500 billion worth of minerals to pay back a fictional debt of $300 billion, then I would be deeply alarmed if I was the Baltic states, asking myself, what happens if I'm invaded? Will these people adhere to Article 5? Do they know what Article 5 is, some of them? If they did know, would they consider it a sacred obligation or a point of leverage to persuade me to hand over some aspect of my national wealth? And worst of all, it's not just Trump. It was the Republican Party as a whole getting behind this humiliation. It was Lindsey Graham. It was Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House. We see what they did. We see what the party has become. A pro-Russian party that revels in the humiliation of allies. And we don't like it, even if we pretend everything's fine at the level of foreign ministers. We understand, what's happening here. And number three is the fundamental risk that Europeans, qua Europe, we can't achieve a unified position on this, right? From 1945 onwards, America's presence in Europe has been not just about keeping the Russians out, it's been about suppressing intra-European disputes and sitting above our politics because we can't agree on stuff. And the risk is, if Trump seeks to normalize with Russia, then what happens to German businesses saying, hey, we want a slice of this pie. We'd like to go back in. We'd like cheap energy, cheap gas. What happens to European unity in suppressing the dissenting views of Viktor Orban of Hungary, of the Slovakian leader? So I think we're worried also that this sets in motion a process in Europe that causes fragmentation. And the summit in London, just this last weekend, which showed great unity, the worry is that may not last as well.
I think was it Hastings Ismay, the first Secretary General of NATO, famously said that the point of it was to keep the Americans in, the Russians out, and the Germans down. Now that feels a little bit unfair on Germany right now, but it seems to have some relevance at the same time. Let's just talk about the situation that Ukraine now faces. So there's a current pause in US support for Ukraine, in military support that Trump has imposed in response to Zelensky's positions last week. That might be reversed, obviously, now that Zelensky has taken a very deep breath and written to Trump, but clearly Trump is prepared to use that lever, and that in itself is instructive. What does it actually mean in practical terms for Ukraine's ability to fight on? I mean, things like air defense with Patriots, possibly Starlink, intelligence sharing, most importantly for threat identification and targeting. Can only the US provide these things, or can Europe plug some of those gaps?
Well, you've outlined the key areas. And I think that the thing to remember is that this isn't an immediate disruption. There is a buffer, there is a gap. The Ukrainians have a good stockpile. The artillery ratio of Russian to Ukrainian shell fire has narrowed to the point of, in some places, near parity, which is a remarkable turnaround from if I was speaking to you this time last year, when Ukraine was in the sort of midst of a crisis from the failure to pass a US supplemental in Congress. And so they can fight on till the summer, even if the aid doesn't come through. Secondly, I'm not completely convinced every last drop of aid has been paused. Just from my conversations with people, I'm hearing mixed things. There is two types of aid. Without meaning to bore everyone, I'll promise I'll be brief. There's Presidential Drawdown Authority, right, where you take stuff from U.S. stocks and you hand it over, and there's USAI, Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, and that's when you put orders in with American companies. And many of those orders are in the pipeline. They've been made. The companies are making the stuff, they're delivering it. And that was due for delivery this year into next year, because these are big, long lead systems, like big, complex air defense systems. Therefore, I have this suspicion, I can't promise you this, but some of the stuff is still coming through. Now, you asked, what can the Europeans offset? And the answer is, well, they can provide a lot of shells, they can provide other stuff, but they have run out of their own stocks. They can't draw down their own stocks very much. It just isn't really possible in most countries. And they had the money. We've just seen Germany raise a huge sum of money for defense using some interesting constitutional chicanery. But at the end of the day, we don't have adequate numbers of things like air defense systems capable of taking out big ballistic missiles, Patriot type systems. Yes, there are Franco-Italian systems, the SAMP-T in Ukraine. From my understanding, is they haven't done quite as well against ballistic attacks. And we can't entirely substitute for the intelligence, because yes, we have surveillance aircraft. The UK has rivet joint aircraft that it flies in the Black Sea, but we don't have as many of them. We don't have constant coverage. We don't have the same geospatial intelligence, particularly in terms of things like electronic radio frequency satellites that can look at the ground and see where things are emitting radiation. So there is going to be an intelligence gap if the intelligence is cut off, which I must stress right now, there is no sign that's happened yet.
So you think the intelligence is still flowing at the moment?
I think the intelligence is still flowing. I don't think all of it is. There was a report in the British press today that there were some restrictions on what the UK was allowed to pass on to Ukraine. But my colleagues tell me from their conversations with Ukrainian sources that at some levels there is still a continued flow of intelligence. And I think that the Trump administration, I can't tell you whether it's set on cutting Ukraine loose. I fear it may be. But I still think it wants to dangle these things as leverage, just like sanctions against Canada, sanctions against Europe. It likes to show that it can do these big, painful things as a means to get something. Now, what that something is can keep changing. And the minerals deal, it used to be the minerals deal. Now it seems to be more than the minerals deal after the Trump speech to Congress. But nonetheless, I still have this feeling that they want Ukraine to listen to them and sign a deal and be compliant. And if they simply cut Ukraine off, then they have very little leverage left at the end of it. So there is an incentive to keep Ukraine on that leash to suit Donald Trump's strategic aims, if the word strategic is not too much of a conceptual stretch to that man.
Indeed. No, it sounds entirely plausible what you're saying. It really does. So let's just talk about how we assess Ukraine's options right now. It's hard to see their position improving in the medium term. They need to be in a strong position in order to negotiate with Russia, whatever mediating role the US is going to play in the middle. And obviously the self-appointed mediator in Trump has decided to announce that he's approaching this as like a sort of neutral broker who's not taking past wrongs into account and is not taking fault or the need to impose costs on Putin into account, certainly not fully. I mean, Putin's already emboldened. He's clearly going to drive a very hard negotiation, and the further Ukraine falls behind, the harder a negotiation he's going to drive, especially if Trump is publicly demanding Ukraine comes to the table, or else he's going to do these things like pull certain types of support. I mean, is that a fair description of the unpalatable situation that Zelensky faces?
I think it is. There was grave concern inside Ukraine among many people over the way he handled that Oval Office meeting. There was profound sympathy for him in the way he was treated, which was abominable. But there was also concern that he could have played his cards somewhat differently. And Ukraine's situation is such that if Europe was waiting in the wings to bail them out and keep them fed with weapons and munitions and intelligence to enable them to defy a bad deal, that he would have some leverage with Trump, but that's not the case. And Ukraine's situation has been stabilizing on the Eastern Front. It's not desperate, it's not dire, he's not on the edge of collapse, but nonetheless, over a 6 month to a year period without American support, they understand that they would be losing territory if they didn't agree to some kind of ceasefire, and that would be a serious risk because they wouldn't be able to get that territory back, given the nature of modern warfare and given the nature of these negotiations. So I think Zelensky's in an extremely difficult spot. I still think there are some in America who would like to get rid of him, who think that he's a troublemaker, he's too principled, he's too set on his conditions for a ceasefire. The charitable interpretation of this is to say, oh, he's not open enough to making the painful concessions necessary for a peace with Russia. The cynical interpretation of this is to say that he won't go along with a ceasefire that has no guarantees, which is a kind of ceasefire that Trump imagines, because he thinks, as he has stated publicly, that the minerals deal will be deterrent enough because, hey, there will be American mining companies inside eastern Ukraine. And I think that this is absurd. Of course, that's not a deterrent, but you can see why Zelensky is saying, if you want me to make these concessions, I need something to show for it. And right now, he has nothing to show for it, nothing at all. And the Europeans are frantically trying to put together these packages saying, look, we will put troops into Ukraine. All you have to do is back us from the rear. You don't have to go in, just back us up. And they are not getting wildly positive responses just now. So all in all, I think Zelensky has a very, very unpalatable set of options. But if diplomacy collapses, I think it is also important to remember, it may be inevitable that Trump blames Zelensky, given his profound antipathy for the man, but it isn't necessarily inevitable, in my view. And I think that he has to make sure that he has to act now as if he is absolutely open to a ceasefire, so that he doesn't get blamed if Trump takes a plan to the Russians and the Russians say no.
Yeah. I mean, there's a fascinating observation about the inconvenience that Zelensky currently represents to some perspectives in the United States. I mean, he also carries just an enormous amount of moral authority attached to him because of the 3 years through which he's led in this sort of Churchillian fashion his country in the very improbable task of resisting Russia for this long. So I think that's a really interesting point. On the minerals deal, I do share your skepticism, and I keep thinking of, imagining myself as the CEO of a US resources company talking to the State Department in a year's time, and they're assuring me that the presence of my staff on some mine site that I'm investing in eastern Ukraine is going to provide a So you're telling me that the tripwire for the US response to renewed Russian aggression is my unarmed civilian staff. I think my HR manager might have something to say about that. But you think it's a nonsense?
I think it's total nonsense. I'm sure the American corporate involvement has some use. You would rather they were there than not there, I suppose. But number one, it's not a physical deterrent, because the Russian army can just move west. And if you move west past a military force, you risk your flanks being attacked and your forces, your supply lines being severed. If you move past a mining site, what's going to happen? The Glencore 51st Brigade is going to attack you. It's a nonsense. But more than that, who thinks that Trump would then think this is an outrage, I must act, as opposed to I want to cut a deal to ensure the safety of my mining operations? Because I'm afraid that this is the administration we're dealing with. We can make fun of the idea of sentimentality in international politics, the idea that concepts like friendship and goodwill are useful ideas. This is a dog-eat-dog world. Nations have interests, they don't have feelings. But actually, I don't know that if that's true. And we speak as from an Anglo-Australian context, both in a bilateral sense and in the wider relationships we're enmeshed in. History, people-to-people ties, culture, cultural intimacy, these all, I think, are glue and cement in the strategic relationships we have with many countries. It's one reason why AUKUS could be done when it could not be done with pretty much any other configuration of actors on the world stage, whether you support it or not. And I think that what Trump is doing in ripping that sentimentality away is exposing some of these alliances for sort of what they are in other cases, which is pure transactionalism, minimal levels of trust, profound doubt about long-term intentions. And actually, I think we're realizing that that's not the sort of alliances we've had for 80 years.
One recent interesting indicator, and I'm still fascinated personally by just the attitude that Trump has towards Russia. I mean, I don't buy into the compromat conspiracy theories or anything like that. I do think that he probably sees Russia as a globally and historically relevant major power that he wants to do business with and he wants to have a relationship with, and therefore they are simply more important to him than any other actor in this present situation. But I'm still not quite sure what it is that he sees in Russia that he seems so determined to sort of pursue in terms of a relationship. One interesting indicator recently was just the reports about the US ending cyber operations. Now, clearly, Russia continues to pose a cyber threat to the United States. That's been the intelligence conclusion for pretty much as long as computers have been around, and yet Hegseth seems to have given this directive to halt or pause those. What can you glean from that decision?
Well, I have to say that we need to be very careful at distinguishing different types of cyber operations, and the halt order seems to have covered things like offensive cyber operations, for example, disrupting Russian networks, attacking Russian networks, maybe information operations. So that's what Cyber Command does. It's a combatant command branch of the Pentagon. It does not seem to cover the NSA, which is America's Signals Intelligence Agency, and there does not appear to be any impact on intelligence gathering in Russia. So we have to make that clear. I also have to make clear that the Department of Defense under Pete Hegseth has denied these reports. They say there is no change to impactful cyber operations. Now, do I believe them? Well, I put a discount on claims coming out of the Trump administration these days, but of course, we should note these denials when they occur. Now, what would it say? I think it fits with a pattern more broadly of the administration believing it must show extreme goodwill towards Russia in order to facilitate these peace talks. That whilst it has to pressure Ukraine, it has to appease Russia. And by that, I mean offering huge numbers of front-loaded concessions. So terminating aggressive information operations could be one, but so too is inviting them back to the G7, refusing to criticize Russia, insisting publicly that Russia did not begin the war by invading Ukraine. And this claim has come out of a number of officials, pretending that it was Ukraine who provoked the conflict. Why would they be saying these things? Well, they may believe some of them, but I think also they think that they have to bend over backwards to placate Russia to make sure the talks go well. Now, I'm not a master negotiator. I'm quite a bad negotiator when I buy things, but even I can see that this is an act of shredding your leverage up front. And I think it's quite astonishing and shocking. Now, I do want to just very briefly address that initial point you made, which is what does he see in the Russians? This is really interesting. We kind of need a psychiatrist rather than, a foreign policy analyst. But fundamentally, I do think it is about the lure of the strongman, the same thing that drew him to Kim Jong-un, that drew him to Xi. Allies are burdens and parasites, but enemies, they are strong, powerful men, and in Putin's case, who share many of the diagnoses of what ails Western civilization, right? Homosexuality, LGBT culture, woke culture, DEI. Well, Putin was anti-woke before it was cool, right? He was the one engaged on anti-gay, anti-LGBT rampages inside Russia many, many years before this took over the Republican Party. And so I think that is a natural point of ideological convergence between the two men.
But the 2018 deal with Kim Jong-un went so well, Shashank. I think you should give some credit to that one.
That's right. Well, not only that fantastic deal, which, as we know, ended North Korea's nuclear threat for years to come, but also the Helsinki deal with Russia, right? The Helsinki meeting, the summit in which he sided with Russian intelligence over his own intelligence agencies, and famously, if you recall, proposed the formation of an impenetrable joint cybersecurity unit with the Russians, which was a particularly genius idea. if you invite them into your networks, they can't hack you. So there's a bit of genius right there.
I mean, it seems extraordinarily miscalculating and off the mark that the Americans think that goodwill towards Putin is actually going to achieve something. I mean, I sort of might understand that Trump personally, because he's got this sort of fixation on his own deal-making ability and his own skills at sitting down with like-minded gentlemen and getting them to do what he wants. He's clearly convinced that that's a talent that he has, but it's remarkable that nobody around him seems to be able to penetrate this idea that if you're nice to Putin, then you will get something positive in return. I mean, are you surprised that no one is able to actually sort of burst that bubble?
That's such a good question. I don't know. I'm trying to make sense myself of the constellation of people around Trump. And you've got this quite cacophonous negotiating team, right? With Kellogg notionally the envoy, but actually he's not in the formal negotiating team, which is Witkoff, who is influential beyond his role. He's a real estate guy. I don't think he played a role in Trump 1. Correct me if I'm wrong, but he's I'm told by officials he's very influential. Then you have Ratcliffe, the head of the CIA. You have Marco Rubio, who seems, kind of cuts a slightly forlorn figure right now. You saw him shrinking into his own body in the Oval Office with that Zelensky meeting. And there's someone else who I'm missing off this list right now. Oh, Mike Waltz, the National Security Advisor, who, again, seems a little bit aloof from these talks, according to people I've been speaking to. But the point is, I am sure that people like Rubio and Kellogg are saying, wow, we need some pressure on the Russians here. They're not going to do a good deal. I don't want to be cynical towards them. I genuinely believe that I may disagree with them on a range of things, but they didn't come into this to hand over the shop to the Russians. And somehow they're not cutting through. And I think that's largely because we're looking at a monarchical type system in a court in which it's the king's whim. I these days find myself analyzing American foreign policy. Sorry, Freudian slip there. Like I do the Kremlin, which is to say you have things said by Sergei Lavrov, the foreign minister, but it's kind of just noise. You have stuff by Patrushev, who was formerly the national security advisor equivalent, and it was just noise. He'd be saying, "Oh yes, the Ukrainian Nazis are building bioweapons in their basements," and you think, "Okay, yeah, okay, thanks for that." You have Sergei Narishkin, the head of the SVR, the Foreign Intelligence Agency, saying, "Oh yeah, the Ukrainians are bioengineering bats to go kill Russians," and they're all just nuts, and you kind of just let it wash over you, but you listen out for the signal amidst the noise. And I kind of find myself taking that same approach with this administration. I mean, what's more useful, to read every pronouncement made by Waltz and Rubio and Kellogg and so on, or is it just to stick open a copy of Truth Social on one of your open browser tabs and read it check in every couple of hours? Would you really be particularly less informed? I'm not so sure about that.
No, indeed. Well, let's try and pick up the mood a little bit for ourselves and the audience by looking at something perhaps a little more positive, which is developments in Europe. I've certainly been surprised on the upside by the leadership that we're seeing in Europe. We've seen Keir Starmer impressive. Macron clearly wants to provide a leadership role. Ursula von der Leyen has made a statement in the last 24 hours or so about new financing for defence spending, which is essentially lifting the sort of debt limits or the deficit limits on European Union members, allowing 650 billion euros in additional spending, plus a loan mechanism of 150 billion euros. Just overall, what's your assessment of the energy that we're seeing and the sense of urgency we're seeing out of the European leadership right now?
Fantastic energy, and I'm so glad you raised the mood a little bit as well, because that's right. I'm really seeing a sense of, what's interesting? I was talking to some people who were at the London summit on Sunday, and they were saying what was striking was to see Mette Frederiksen of Denmark, candidate for NATO SecGen before Rutte got the job, and Donald Tusk of Poland. These two super transatlanticist leaders, unbelievably transatlanticist countries, sounding so ultra-European, so on board with what the French and the British were proposing, by way of putting something on the European offer on the table, and that just really sums up the mood, right? You have countries like Denmark that said in January they were boasting, we've got such great relations with the Americans, we've got we were the key allies in Afghanistan, we had no caveats on our force, we have all this amazing signals intelligence relationship, and we've got Greenland, we're cooperating on Greenland for the Arctic, and of course it didn't save them, it doesn't save anybody. And so the Europeans I see them shaken to a degree I never saw in Trump 1, even in 2018 when there was a moment at which it looked as though Trump might pull out of NATO at the summit that year. And this is different. And it's different not just in words and rhetoric, but now it's different in money. It's different in the announcements made by the European Union. And I caution, your listeners may have been hearing the numbers 800 billion euros on the EU side. Those numbers are not entirely kind of completely credible. There's a little bit of exaggeration going on there, because about 650 billion euros of that figure is assuming member states would spend 1.5% of GDP extra on defense over the next 4 years. And that was kind of based on the fact that they had already announced a relaxation of EU rules on budget deficit. So the long and short of it is be wary of numbers, but nonetheless, the change in rules is significant. And in Germany, this is a big deal. It's a government, an incoming chancellor, basically cutting a deal with what he anticipates will be the next government, but passing it in the existing parliament before the next parliament has taken hold. And it will allow German defense spending to rise substantially. Now, I think the French may follow. Let's see where the French goes. I see Macron. As we speak, Macron is due to address the French people on Wednesday, the 5th of March, in the European evening. And so I'm aware he may have made his remarks by the time this goes out, but I wouldn't be surprised if he announces a substantial increase in defense spending, which is going to be, he has himself raised the question of could it rise to 3%, 3.5%. That would be very difficult to him given his own debt restrictions and the state of parliament in his country. And the Brits have gone to 2.5% with a by 2027, which is quite slow, but I can see that rising further if we announce any deployment in Ukraine, which would be quite expensive. So the long and short of it is, I see a big change. However, let's get realistic. We still depend on the Americans for a bunch of stuff, and we cannot change that in a matter of 1 or 2 years. So we have this huge dilemma of how much do we go along with them and engage them and buy ourselves time to rearm, and how much do we say, we're not going to do this, we break with you, and we build our own defenses, but that's unbelievably expensive. You have to do it in an unbelievably short period of time. You are vulnerable in the interim, and even if you have money to buy weapons, you may need to end up buying some of them from the Americans. And that's a bitter pill to swallow for countries like France, which of course are saying, don't be ridiculous, you have to buy European. We can't just funnel more money to the Americans, because we've seen what happens when we do that.
I mean, fortunately, I suppose both objectives, whether it's security independence or persuading the Americans that we are still allies worth having a relationship with, for the time being at least, looks more or less the same, which is just to, for God's sake, spend more money on defence. So is it, can they just sort of pursue that objective as quickly as possible? With the hope of keeping the Americans in so that they don't actually have to, turn an enormous task into a almost inconquerable task, which is to be able to do everything themselves. Is that a reasonable kind of approach they should be taking now?
Yeah, I think that is the approach, and that even for the French, who believe in strategic autonomy and have a more aggressive approach to this, that's their approach as well. But the dilemmas are really acute in some cases, and the UK is one of them. As you know, the UK's nuclear deterrent depends on American technology. We share a pool of missiles with the Americans, the Trident D5 missiles. The aeroshell or re-entry vehicle for our nuclear warheads really is a joint collaboration with the Americans. And look at the future of AUKUS, right? We have these 30, 40-year dependencies in military technology on the American side. How do you unwind those? How do you begin to unwind those? Do you assume that you can have a capability alliance with the Americans where they will still agree to maintain Trident with you, even if you break with them strategically on everything else? Or are you effectively bound on some issues to stick with the Americans, particularly in an AUKUS context where you have ITAR restrictions having been lifted last year and a little mini defense kind of zone involving the UK, Australia, and the US? So what does that do? What does that mean if the French say, come on, let's develop a new ballistic missile together. I think that these are profoundly difficult questions for the British government at a moment of crisis, and the answer to them will depend on how radical the Trump administration gets.
Well, I'm glad to hear that AUKUS, is a relevant consideration in all of this, obviously from an Australian point of view. I will finish, but I just want to ask you about the Indo-Pacific as well. I mean, obviously Beijing will be watching all of this very closely and probably with some glee. How might Beijing read Washington's commitment to the Indo-Pacific right now? I mean, do you think it's going to be taking any pointers from the way Donald Trump is conducting himself with respect to Europe and Russia? Are the circumstances sufficiently different that it's not necessarily a useful model for Beijing to make predictions about US commitment to the Indo-Pacific? And I suppose out of all of that, I mean, what do you think in Australia, a US ally like Australia, might usefully be thinking about now in terms of, again, that US commitment?
Well, I think that there's no strategy right now. There just isn't a strategy. If this was the idea was, hey, we can wind down in Europe, shift forces to Asia, double down our commitment, that's one thing. I see no indication that pivot approach is really what's guiding their strategy here. As I said earlier, I believe ideological considerations towards Russia are much more of a factor in all of this right now. And that worries me. And I think if I was an Asian ally, you can see why in theory you might think, hey, Americans are bogged down in Europe. What the hell are they doing with all this air defense and these assets in Europe that we need in the Indo-Pacific? Actually, I don't know how you feel. When I was in Australia in October and speaking to officials, but also listening to Taiwanese and Japanese officials, I sense quite a lot of disquiet about this because they worry that an administration that it's not just that it doesn't like the commitments in Europe as a practical matter, it just doesn't seem to like allies. It just doesn't seem to think America has this bond with allies that really matters in any substantive way. And that, it wouldn't necessarily view their defense as fundamental to America's standing in the world. I was listening to Bridge Colby's Senate hearing yesterday, confirmation hearing. This is the incoming, if he's confirmed, the incoming policy chief for the Pentagon, and a long-standing so-called prioritizer saying less Europe, more Asia, right? And he said Taiwan is not an existential interest to the United States. Okay, now maybe that's fair enough. Taiwan is not existential. I think we could probably agree that, but I don't think the signals coming out of this American administration on what they're interested in, which is Greenland, Panama, Canada, territorial expansion in the Western Hemisphere, cutting a deal with Russia. Does that suggest to you that they think Taiwan and the defense perimeter there is critical to American interests in Asia and to avoiding a Chinese hegemony in Asia, which Bridge did say was important? Or does it suggest they would be much more open to a grand bargain with the Chinese? One in which you would have a fourth communique over Taiwan, one in which you would maybe effectively grant China the right of unification and say the Americans would not get in the way over a period of a number of years. I worry profoundly about that, and I don't think we have any clarity, and I don't think we have any sense of guarantee on this. And indeed, I think that right now we are more likely to be looking at a large scale damage being done to the American alliance system globally, rather than just a small European shock confined to our region.
Yeah. I mean, I know obviously Bridge Colby is the prominent champion of that sort of reprioritization theory. I guess my observation would be that it's so hard to know whether there's any kind of logic to that when, I mean, Trump was talking to Congress today about achieving a balanced budget in the foreseeable future. They've got an omnibus bill that's going to contain all sorts of budget measures which we don't even know is going to get through. There are just so many uncertainties. We don't know that Trump actually ever wants to deploy military power in the Indo-Pacific, even if he has the assets to do so. So I think the reprioritization theory, as I think you've just articulated really well, is just sort of so mythically speculative for the time being there's not much point in thinking too much about it. I suppose the sense of disquiet, I think, is definitely here in Australia's region. The difference for Australia, and Australia is in an unusual position in that we have another ally in New Zealand, but really our security determinations have been entirely reliant on the United States for as long as we can remember, and there's no Asian NATO. There isn't anyone else that we can really turn to. We've got a great relationship with Japan, and we've got really good friendships with some others in Asia and across the Indo-Pacific, but we really do need the Americans in the way that perhaps the Germans, French and the British don't, insofar as at least they have conceivable options going forward if things really go to custard with the Americans. So I guess...
Can I ask you a question? I'm just interested in your view on this, which is to say that, do you think that if we see more of these signals, that actually I'm interested in deal making, I'm interested in an economic deal with China, I'm interested in hemispheric spheres of influence, do you think that this down the line strengthens the line of argument in Australia that has always said we should focus on close defense, our near shores, forget about projecting power into Northeast Asia. We can live with Chinese expansions in Northeast Asia. What we have to focus on is our northern approaches. Does that line of argument get strengthened, or instead is it just no? We need to do more with the Japanese, more with the Indians, more with the Koreans, and there's a kind of alternative route to that more expeditionary Australian philosophy?
So I have no doubt that some of the voices who champion a kind of foreign policy or security independence for Australia, which is to make ourselves a sort of small, spiny, an echidna in our, what's the term, biological or natural history term. But those voices are pretty fringe, I think. Certainly, I mean, in the security community and in the policy community, it's a very unusual attitude these days. The recognition that we need reliable trade routes, that we need a safe region, because so much of our economic output it comes in the form of exports, and we rely very, very heavily on things like sea lines of communication. That's a well-established thing. We've been talking for a while anyway about deepening our relationships with countries like India, with countries like Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, etc. And hence, things like the Quad are extremely welcome for Australia. So we've been doing that anyway, with the recognition that the United States under Trump or anyone else is going to grow increasingly grumpy about carrying too much of the burden in this region, and that we need to do more with other countries in this region to relieve some of that burden. So in a sense, a lot of that is happening anyway. I think people have got used to that. So look, my view would be that it's much more the latter option that you raised there, which is that we strengthen things elsewhere. But a bit like with Europe, it's very much with an aim towards keeping the Americans in, because I don't think anyone realistically thinks that we can resist or even seriously constrain some sort of Chinese regional hegemony with only Australia, Japan, India, Korea, etc. We do rely on the Americans to stay in, and I think that's going to be the approach for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, and the only thing I'd add to that very helpful answer is to say that we haven't discussed it very much, and maybe we probably can't get into it now because it would take a long time. But the nuclear question, will arise again in the Trump years, and the question of allies who feel at risk of conventional abandonment will have to think about nuclear options. And in the European context, that has initially taken the form of discussions around Anglo-French nuclear deterrence and how that applies and may be strengthened to apply in the rest of Europe. But lurking behind that is the question you hear coming up about, actually, would Poland be interested in a nuclear program of its own? Would Ukraine, in the long run, could it do that? And in the Asian context, of course, these debates focus on South Korea and Japan. But actually, you can see that in a world where traditional assumptions are falling away, in a world where traditional taboos erode, actually it may not be so outlandish to ask questions around other countries and their own interest in nuclear weapons programs as means of the ultimate defense in an age when great powers are cutting deals above the heads of smaller ones.
Yeah, I don't think that taboo has quite fallen away in Australia yet, but at the pace things are moving, who knows, next time we talk it might have. But I think more realistically, if it were to come to that, I think we would probably look to Japan or India or somebody like that to provide an extended deterrence to Australia. I can't imagine Australia pursuing its own weapons program.
Yeah. No, well, that's reassuring to hear for the short term.
In terms of proliferation, indeed. All right, look, Shashank, you've been really generous with your time. We'll finish it up, but look, it's been a terrific conversation. I've really appreciated it. It's lovely to have someone who's so able to provide clarity both in speaking and in written work on such complex issues. So thank you, and let's talk again.
Thank you so much for having me again. It's a real pleasure.
That's all we have time for today, folks. Thanks for listening to Stop the World. We'll be back with another episode soon with another special guest, Dave.
That's right. I interviewed Constanze Stelzenmuller from the Brookings Institution on the latest developments in Europe and the US, and it's a nice continuation from this episode. I really enjoyed speaking with Constanze. Look out for it this weekend.
That's all from us. Ciao.